Hi, I'm Oakley, 42 years old. I was married to David for 15 years, and we built what everyone else called a normal life. But behind closed doors, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. For months, I noticed little things. A message he quickly deleted, a late-night call he brushed off. Something was wrong. Something I couldn't quite put into words. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and subscribe for more stories about family drama and emotional courage. The morning started like any other, but I already felt that prickling unease that had become all too familiar. I was in our small kitchen, the one with chipped tiles and a stubborn faucet that always dripped no matter how many times David tightened it. I sipped my coffee slowly, watching the sunlight filter through the blinds, noticing the small dust motes dance in the golden haze. It was a quiet, ordinary moment, yet my stomach twisted with tension. My mind kept going back to the strange message he had received the night before, the one he insisted was from work, though he was evasive when I asked who it was. Over the years, I had learned to notice subtle patterns, the ones most people overlook. The way he smiled just a little too forced when I asked a simple question. The hurried glance at his phone when it buzzed on the counter. A scent of someone else's cologne lingering faintly on his jacket, one he claimed was from the dry cleaner. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that 15 years of trust and companionship weren't so easily broken. Yet the unease remained, like a shadow stretching across a room I thought I knew well. I went about my morning routine mechanically, feeding the dog, checking the mailbox, and straightening the kitchen. David was still asleep upstairs, or at least I hoped he was. Part of me dreaded facing him, yet another part needed some kind of confrontation, even if it was only with my own thoughts. I opened the journal I had kept for nearly a decade, a habit born out of necessity more than anything else. I wrote down the mundane, the groceries I needed, the bills I had paid, the meetings at work. But hidden within the lists and reminders were small, almost invisible threads of my observations. Little things about David that didn't sit right. His late nights, his sudden defensiveness, the soft excuses he offered when I asked too many questions. The journal had started as a way to keep track of our lives, a way to make sense of the chaos of raising kids, paying bills, and balancing work. But over the years, it became my anchor. Whenever I felt uncertain or scared, I wrote it down. Names, dates, conversations, feelings. Sometimes I even sketched timelines, drawing little arrows between events that didn't make sense in isolation but formed a pattern when connected. At the time, I didn't realize how important this practice would become, or that these notes would one day serve as proof of the truth I could barely admit to myself. That morning, I sat at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around the mug, and I read the entries from the past month. The writing was neat, deliberate, almost methodical, but the content betrayed my anxiety. On April 3rd, I had written, David came home late again. He says it was a work dinner, but he smelled different. I noticed the perfume on his coat. Am I imagining things? On April 10th, he laughed at something on his phone in the middle of the night, whispered a name I didn't recognize. He says it's a coworker. I don't know if I should trust him. Each line pulled me deeper into worry, yet gave me clarity. I realized I wasn't paranoid. I had been keeping track all along, documenting the invisible breadcrumbs that, when connected, painted a picture I was afraid to acknowledge. I tried to distract myself by tidying up the living room. The children's toys were strewn across the carpet, remnants of the previous night's chaos. I picked up a small wooden train, wiped off the dust, and set it neatly on the shelf. In that moment, the house felt unbearably quiet, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to break the fragile illusion of normalcy. I wondered if David felt the tension too, or if he was blissfully unaware of the storm gathering just beneath the surface of our lives. By mid-morning, I decided to go to the grocery store. On the way, I tried to convince myself to focus on mundane things: milk, bread, eggs, anything to prevent my mind from spiraling. But every passing car, every hurried glance at my phone, every familiar street corner reminded me of David and his evasiveness. When I reached the store, I deliberately walked down every aisle slowly, letting my eyes wander and my thoughts run wild. I imagined scenarios in which I confronted him, scenarios in which I ignored the signs, scenarios in which everything unraveled in public, in private, and within my own heart. At the checkout line, a young cashier smiled at me, and I forced a small smile back. Inside, my mind raced through lists of questions I had been too afraid to ask. Names, times, places, faces. Could I really trust the narrative he presented? The cashier handed me my receipt, and for a fleeting moment, the normalcy of that small interaction made me ache with longing for the life I thought I had. But as I loaded the groceries into the car, I felt the weight of what was coming, the inevitability of discovery, of confrontation, of reckoning. Back at home, I put the groceries away methodically, like performing a ritual to maintain control over a life that was quietly slipping from my grasp. I noticed small signs that didn't make sense. The coffee mug from his office, left on the counter when he swore he had been working late. A receipt tucked under the couch cushion for a restaurant I didn't recognize. Little pieces of evidence that weren't yet conclusive, but enough to make my heart race and my hands tremble as I picked up my journal and added a new entry. I don't know what's coming. I don't know if I'm imagining things, or if the truth is far worse than I can bear. But I will remember it all. I spent the afternoon in a haze of tension, alternating between household chores and quiet observation. I kept glancing at the clock, calculating when he would arrive, rehearsing in my mind what I might say, what I might do, and how I might react. I was hyper-aware of every sound: the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the rustle of leaves outside. My thoughts wandered to friends I had confided in subtly over the years. What would they say if they knew the full story? Would they believe me? Could I even bring myself to tell anyone before I had proof? By evening, I decided to prepare dinner. Cooking had always been a way to channel stress into something tangible, something I could control. As I chopped vegetables, I imagined countless what-ifs that might unfold: a sudden confession, an accidental slip, an unexpected visitor at the door. The knife felt steady in my hand, yet my chest was tight with anticipation. Every sound upstairs, the creak of the staircase, the muffled thump of his steps, made me flinch and glance at the clock again. The calm of domestic life had been shattered, replaced by an invisible tension that threaded every corner of the house. As David finally arrived home, his presence was ordinary, almost casual, but I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I watched him hang his coat, brush his shoes, and pour himself a drink, all while carefully observing for any signs of deception. The way he avoided eye contact, the slight hesitation before answering questions, the soft chuckle he forced when he realized I was paying attention, it all confirmed my worst fears, yet still left me clinging to hope. I reminded myself: patience, observation, documentation. My journal would be my witness, and I would wait until the truth could no longer hide in shadows. By bedtime, I had meticulously recorded every detail of the day in my journal. My hands ached slightly from writing, but there was a strange comfort in the act. I felt like a silent detective in my own life, piecing together fragments that others overlooked. And as I turned off the light and climbed into bed, I could feel the storm gathering beyond the walls of our home, waiting for the moment when the calm would finally break, revealing everything I had suspected all along. Even in the quiet darkness, I held on to a fragile hope that by observing, recording, and trusting my instincts, I might find clarity, justice, or at least the truth. The calm before the storm had stretched long enough, and I knew deep down that the tension, the unease, and the heartbreak I had felt for weeks were about to converge into a life-changing moment I couldn't yet fully imagine. I had barely closed my eyes when a strange restlessness pulled me back into consciousness. The weight of anticipation from the previous day hadn't lifted. It had only grown heavier overnight, pressing against my chest like a stone. I couldn't sleep, and part of me dreaded the day ahead, knowing it might bring confirmation of my worst fears. When I finally rose from bed, the house was still silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I moved slowly to the kitchen, careful not to wake David, and found myself glancing once more at the journal I had placed on the counter the night before. I traced my fingers over the leather cover, thinking about how it had become more than a notebook. It had become a map of my life, of my suspicions, and of the subtle betrayals I had begun to notice months ago. I opened it to the most recent entries, hoping for some kind of reassurance, though deep down I knew the reassurance wouldn't come. My hands trembled slightly as I reread the lines about the perfume I had smelled on his jacket, the unexplained late nights, the whispers in the middle of the night. Each entry, once just words, now felt prophetic. Then it happened. A small detail, almost insignificant at first, tipped everything into clarity. While I was straightening the living room, a folded receipt slipped out from under the couch cushion. It was easy to overlook, but something about the handwriting caught my eye. My stomach sank as I read the restaurant name, a place he had claimed he had never visited. The date was last Thursday, the same night he said he was working late at the office. I felt a cold knot tighten in my chest, an uncomfortable mix of shock, disbelief, and a creeping sense of betrayal. For a moment, I froze. I felt like the room was spinning, yet the silence around me made everything seem sharper. I held the receipt as if it might shatter in my hands, and suddenly the careful facade of my normal life felt absurdly fragile. Every little inconsistency, every dismissed feeling, every anxious entry in my journal suddenly formed a clear, undeniable pattern. My mind raced. This isn't imagination. I'm not overreacting. This is real. The next hours were a blur of quiet observation and cautious investigation. I moved through the house like a detective, noticing every little thing. His coffee mug still sat on the counter, the one he used during his supposed late night at the office. The smell of cologne lingered faintly, richer than the one he usually wore, and it wasn't just an ordinary scent. It was someone else's. On the counter, a small scrap of paper with a phone number written in a familiar scrawl caught my eye. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to stay calm. Every observation had to be documented, recorded, and understood before I allowed myself to confront him. I spent the next hour scanning through his emails on the shared family computer, careful to avoid leaving fingerprints or alerts. I didn't need to dig too far. The evidence was subtle, but sufficient. There were innocuous messages, one-liners exchanged late at night, some tagged with hearts or playful emojis. Each one confirmed my suspicions. The casual work-related explanations he had given were lies. My hands shook as I opened each message, my mind both resisting and craving the truth. I wanted proof, yes, but I also feared what proof would mean. When David came home that afternoon, I felt a strange combination of dread and resolve. He walked in casually, carrying a briefcase, whistling softly, as if nothing had changed. My stomach knotted as I watched him hang his coat, the subtle traces of someone else's perfume brushing past me. I didn't speak at first. I pretended to be immersed in the grocery bags, arranging the cans and boxes with mechanical precision. But every glance, every hesitation in his smile told me he was aware I knew, or at least that I was beginning to suspect. I tried to act normal, asking him about his day, chatting lightly about work, the children, and the neighbors. he answered, but there was a slight edge to his tone, a defensiveness I hadn't noticed before. My observations were silent yet piercing, like small needles of truth embedding themselves into the narrative of our life together. The casual lies he had woven into our shared routines were unraveling, thread by thread, and I felt both grief and a strange sense of empowerment. Later that evening, I returned to my journal. I wrote feverishly, not just recounting the day, but dissecting each moment with precision. The receipt, the messages, the cologne, the uncharacteristic defensiveness. Every detail went into the pages. I mapped out a timeline. Thursday night, office late work. Thursday night, the restaurant visit. Thursday night, whispered phone messages. When I stepped back and looked at it, the pieces formed an unmistakable picture. The betrayal I had only feared for weeks now had substance, and the clarity was almost unbearable. The children came home from school mid-afternoon, their chatter and laughter a stark contrast to the storm brewing silently around me. I forced myself to smile, to meet their eyes with warmth, all while mentally tracking David's movements. Every sound, the clatter of the backpack hitting the floor, the rustling of their jackets, was amplified in my mind. I realized then that the home I had painstakingly maintained was no longer just a refuge. It had become a stage where the truth was waiting to emerge. Over dinner, I noticed subtle behaviors I had overlooked before. David's attention kept drifting to his phone. His laughter at our children's stories seemed slightly off, rehearsed. I could feel the tension in the room, though I alone sensed its magnitude. My hands rested lightly on the table, and I reminded myself to breathe slowly. I couldn't confront him yet, not without solid proof. This moment, as ordinary as it seemed, was the turning point. The betrayal wasn't abstract anymore. It wasn't the perfume, the receipt, or the messages alone. It was the culmination of years of quiet deception, finally exposed in small but undeniable fragments. After the children were tucked into bed, I sat alone in the living room, a single lamp casting a warm glow over the furniture. I revisited every observation, every inconsistency in my mind. My hands moved instinctively to the journal, flipping to pages I had written months before. Entries I had barely thought about suddenly held new significance. I traced the lines of text that detailed suspicious conversations, unexplained absences, and fleeting glimpses of a hidden world beyond my knowledge. For the first time, the fragments connected in a coherent story, revealing the reality I had been too hesitant to confront. The journal had become my lifeline. I realized that if I had ignored the subtle signs, the betrayal could have continued unnoticed for years. I thought about all the moments he had dismissed my concerns, the times I had questioned my own judgment, every instance of doubt, every whispered, "Maybe I'm overreacting," to myself, now felt like a prelude to the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when the truth could no longer hide behind excuses. In the quiet of that evening, I made a decision. I would not confront him blindly. I would collect every piece of evidence, every inconsistency, and document it meticulously. My journal would serve not only as my emotional outlet, but as a record of reality, a witness to the deception that had been woven into our lives. I felt a strange mixture of sadness, anger, and determination. The man I had loved and trusted for 15 years had built a secret life, and I needed to ensure that the reality of it could no longer be ignored. The hours passed slowly, each tick of the clock a reminder of the inevitability of confrontation. I revisited the kitchen, the couch, and the bedrooms, retracing movements I had observed that day, noticing the faintest traces of things that didn't belong. A lipstick stain on a coffee mug, a folded note left on the nightstand, the faint echo of a name I couldn't place. It was all part of the mosaic of betrayal. The realization hit me with an almost physical force. I had been living alongside a stranger, a man whose outward warmth masked deceit I could now trace with precision. By late evening, I felt both exhausted and strangely invigorated. The day had shattered the illusion of our life together, and yet, in the midst of grief and anger, I felt clarity for the first time in weeks. I had proof, observation, and a meticulously documented record of the betrayal I had long suspected. My journal had transformed from a private coping mechanism into a weapon of truth. I closed it gently, as if sealing away both the pain and the empowerment it contained, knowing that the days ahead would require courage, precision, and patience. Even as I turned off the lights and climbed into bed, the weight of discovery lingered. I felt a tremor of anxiety, wondering how David would react if he sensed I had pieced together the reality he had hidden. Yet alongside, it was a quiet sense of purpose. The truth was no longer a vague, haunting suspicion. It was tangible, undeniable, and waiting for the right moment to surface. That night, I dreamed of conversations I hadn't yet had, of confrontations I feared, of the quiet vindication I longed for. I could see the pattern of months, years even, unfolding before me. Each fragment of deceit meticulously documented, each small betrayal now a part of the undeniable reality. And as the first light of morning filtered through the blinds, I understood something I hadn't fully realized before. The storm had begun the moment I discovered the first piece of evidence, and nothing, no lies, no excuses, no avoidance, could stop the reckoning that was coming. The next morning, I woke with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. The discovery of David's deception had left a raw ache in my chest, but amidst the heartbreak, a determined resolve had taken root. Today was the day I would take the first concrete step toward reclaiming my life. I moved slowly, almost ritualistically, around the kitchen. The coffee machine hissed as it brewed a fresh pot, filling the air with a familiar, comforting aroma. I didn't sip it immediately. Instead, I sat at the table, journal in hand, reviewing every piece of evidence I had carefully collected. Each note, each timeline, each tiny observation had a purpose now. Making the decision to file for divorce felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating. For 15 years, I had tied my identity to our marriage, the shared routines, the quiet evenings, the small domestic victories. But the knowledge of David's affair had changed everything. I was no longer living in an illusion. I was living alongside a man who had actively betrayed the life we built together. I picked up my phone and called a local law office I had researched the night before. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and reassuring. For the first time in months, I felt like I had an ally who could navigate the murky waters I was about to enter. The attorney, a middle-aged woman named Karen, listened patiently as I recounted my situation. I told her about the late-night messages, the perfume on his coat, the restaurant receipts, and, finally, about the journal. I explained that I had meticulously documented everything over several months, fearing I might one day need proof. Karen's voice softened with understanding. She didn't dismiss me or tell me to wait. Instead, she offered concrete steps. We discussed filing, evidence collection, and, most importantly, the potential impact of using the journal in court. Her calm professionalism was like a balm for the chaos in my mind. Hanging up the phone, I felt a mixture of relief and dread. Filing for divorce meant exposing every hidden corner of our life. It meant that David would finally see the depth of my awareness and, perhaps, my quiet strategy. But it also meant confronting the fear I had buried for months. The idea that our life together, the home, the shared memories, the sense of family, would never be the same. I looked around the living room, noting the small signs of domestic life, The framed photos of our children smiling on vacation, the half-finished knitting project on the sofa, the stack of books by the window. These were not just objects. They were reminders of everything I had tried to protect. And now they would all be caught in the upheaval I was about to initiate. I spent the afternoon gathering my evidence systematically. I organized the receipts, the messages, and any documents that confirmed David's movements. I transcribed the messages into the journal to create a chronological flow that would be easy to present. Each entry, each note became a bullet point in my mental outline of the case. I wasn't just writing for myself anymore. I was writing for justice, for clarity, and, in some quiet corner of my mind, for the satisfaction of proving the truth. Every piece of evidence was a small reassurance that I wasn't imagining anything. This wasn't paranoia. This was reality, documented meticulously and ready to be used strategically. That evening, David came home. I noticed immediately that his demeanor had changed slightly. He seemed more careful, more calculated, and yet unaware of the storm he was walking into. I greeted him politely, making no mention of the lawyer or the documents I had organized. Instead, I maintained a calm facade, carrying myself with a quiet confidence that I hadn't displayed in years. He responded with casual banter, asking about my day, about the kids, about errands. I answered mechanically, my mind elsewhere, scanning the room for even the slightest sign that he suspected anything. But he seemed oblivious, and that made my resolve even stronger. That night, I revisited the journal again. I highlighted the entries that detailed David's suspicious behavior, the receipts, the unexplained absences, and the whispered conversations. I began drafting a document that I planned to submit alongside the divorce petition, a personal impact statement of sorts. I wrote about the emotional toll his betrayal had taken on me, on our children, and on the life we had built. I wrote with honesty, without embellishment, letting the words flow naturally. I wanted the judge to understand not just the facts, but the emotional reality that David had ignored. It was time to turn years of quiet observation into undeniable proof. As I typed the document, I thought back to the smallest details that often go unnoticed. The way David's laughter at dinner sometimes seemed forced, the subtle avoidance when I asked about colleagues, the minor discrepancies in his schedule. All these fragments of life now formed a coherent story. I realized the power of observation, patience, and documentation. For years, I had dismissed my own instincts, wondering if I was overreacting. But now, every entry, every note validated my intuition. My journal had become more than a diary. It had become my secret weapon. I spent the next few days in quiet preparation, balancing domestic responsibilities with legal research. I contacted friends selectively, asking discreet questions about local family court procedures. I researched similar cases online, noting how personal statements were treated in court and how evidence of infidelity and emotional neglect could influence proceedings. The more I learned, the more empowered I felt. I wasn't acting out of revenge alone. I was acting to protect myself, to safeguard my dignity, and to ensure that the truth was recognized formally. During this time, David's behavior remained consistently dismissive. He continued to leave work at odd hours, occasionally bringing home small gifts that he thought would placate me, and sometimes speaking in half-truths that didn't quite align. I noticed the pattern, and it reinforced my determination. I silently cataloged every movement, every inconsistency, every moment where his story diverged from the documented reality. Each small contradiction was a thread I could pull in court, a way to unravel the web of deceit he had spun so casually. Late one night, as I sat at the kitchen table under the soft glow of a single lamp, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. I thought about the years I had invested in this marriage, the sacrifices, the quiet compromises, and the small joys that had made life feel whole. But I also recognized the harsh truth. A life built on lies was no longer sustainable. The journal had illuminated the path forward. My secret weapon was ready, not in anger or malice, but in meticulous documentation, emotional clarity, and unwavering resolve. I also began practicing what I would say in court, rehearsing my tone and pacing. I wanted my statements to sound natural, grounded, and credible, not rehearsed or vindictive. I knew that presenting the journal as evidence required more than just the facts. It required conveying the emotional reality behind them. I imagined the courtroom, the judge, and the subtle shifts in David's demeanor as each piece of proof was presented. I envisioned the precise moment when the truth would emerge, not in a dramatic outburst, but in calm, undeniable clarity. The children sensed the tension in the house, even if they didn't fully understand it. I made sure to shield them as best as I could, maintaining routines, providing comforting meals, and keeping bedtime rituals consistent. Yet, every time I tucked them in, I felt a pang of guilt for the world they were about to inherit, the disruption, the upheaval, the inevitable questions. I wrote about this in my journal as well, noting that the divorce was not just a legal maneuver, but a necessary step to protect the emotional and physical well-being of our family. I also began to anticipate David's reactions. I imagined how he might respond if he sensed that I had concrete evidence, how he might attempt to discredit me or manipulate narratives in his favor. Preparing for these possibilities became an exercise in mental fortitude. I planned contingencies for each potential scenario. If he denied the receipts, if he lied about schedules, if he attempted to minimize the emotional impact. My strategy was simple but effective. Remain composed, rely on documented evidence, and let the truth speak for itself. A few days later, I visited the law office to finalize the filing. Karen guided me through each form, explaining the nuances of the petition, custody arrangements, and asset division. My journal, which had felt like a personal refuge, now felt like a tangible instrument of empowerment. We discussed how to present it in court without sounding vindictive or overly emotional. Karen assured me that the authenticity of my entries, combined with the factual evidence, would carry significant weight. For the first time in weeks, I felt a measure of calm. The storm was approaching, but I was ready. Returning home, I placed the journal on the kitchen counter, open to the carefully highlighted entries. I traced the ink with my fingers, feeling the years of observation, patience, and subtle vigilance converge into a plan that could no longer be ignored. This was my truth, my preparation, my secret weapon. The act of writing, documenting, and organizing had transformed my grief and anger into focused clarity. I felt stronger than I had in months, aware, determined, and ready to face the consequences of unveiling reality. In the days following the filing, David remained oblivious. He continued his routines, unaware that the life he had maintained on half-truths and deception was unraveling quietly, piece by piece. I watched him with a detached curiosity, cataloging every gesture, every phrase, and every glance. The journal served not only as evidence, but also as a mirror of my own resilience. I had discovered something essential: the power of deliberate action, observation, and strategic patience. As I lay in bed each night, I reflected on the delicate balance between grief and empowerment. The divorce filing was no longer just a legal procedure. It had become a personal declaration. I had reclaimed control over my narrative, prepared meticulously, and ensured that when the truth emerged, it would do so in a way that could not be denied. I felt a quiet satisfaction in the knowledge that the journal, once a private outlet, was now an integral instrument of justice. By the end of the week, I felt a shift within myself. The emotional fog of betrayal had cleared slightly, replaced by focused determination. I had taken the first step toward liberation, and the journal had become a symbol of my preparation, my patience, and my unwavering commitment to truth. Every small detail, every documented inconsistency had transformed from private observation into a strategic advantage. I knew that when the day arrived for court, my secret weapon would speak louder than any argument he could muster. The morning of the hearing arrived with a chill that seemed to creep through the courthouse doors and settle deep in my bones. I had rehearsed this day countless times in my mind, but nothing could fully prepare me for the physical tightening in my chest, the restless flutter in my stomach. I clutched my journal under my arm like a shield, its leather cover worn from countless hours of careful writing and review. Each entry, each highlighted note, felt heavier than it had before, loaded with the weight of truth, years of observation, and my quiet patience. As I walked through the towering doors of the family court, the smell of polished wood and faintly chemical cleaning products filled the air. The waiting room was sparsely furnished with stiff chairs and a few potted plants that had seen better days. Families waited quietly, whispering, flipping through documents, or staring into nothing. I tried to keep my steps measured, to breathe slowly, to appear calm, but my mind raced. The people around me were strangers, yet the tension in the room mirrored my own inner storm. I spotted David across the room, sitting with his lawyer. He seemed unusually composed, almost smug, flipping through a folder with an expression that suggested confidence. I caught a glimpse of his eyes flicker toward me, a brief hesitation before he looked away, trying to maintain control. His demeanor was deliberate, practiced, but beneath the surface, I sensed the first flicker of unease, the faint tremor of uncertainty he could not completely hide. I allowed myself a small, private smile. I had waited for this moment for months, and I was ready. The bailiff called our names, and we rose to enter the courtroom. The room itself was solemn, with high ceilings, muted beige walls, and polished oak furniture that gleamed under the overhead lights. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed David, my mind alternating between dread and determination. I glanced at my journal, tucked safely on the edge of the witness stand. This was not just a book. It was a testament to the years I had observed, recorded, and analyzed every small thread of deceit, ready to unravel the narrative he had carefully constructed. The judge entered, a stern woman with sharp features and an authoritative presence that immediately demanded attention. Her eyes swept the room, taking in each of us briefly, before settling on the documents in front of her. I felt a wave of anxiety, tempered by focus. This was the moment when preparation met reality. My hands rested lightly on the journal, tracing its spine as I tried to steady my breathing. The air seemed heavier now, the quiet punctuated only by the soft shuffle of papers and the subtle hum of distant voices outside the courtroom doors. David's lawyer began the proceedings, outlining the filing, the basic facts of the marriage, and the petition for divorce. I listened quietly, absorbing each word while remaining calm on the surface. Inside, my thoughts were precise, timing, evidence presentation. When my turn came to speak, I stepped forward, placing the journal deliberately on the stand, letting the leather cover rest flat, so the judge could see it. I opened to the first highlighted entry, reading aloud in a voice steady but emotionally authentic. Every word mattered. The subtle betrayals, the inconsistencies, the small cumulative actions that revealed the larger truth of his deceit. The first few sentences passed with polite attention, but the courtroom remained quiet. Then, as I began reading entries that documented dates, receipts, and the messages he had sent, I saw the slight paling of David's face. His hand tightened around the arm of his chair. His lawyer's confident expression faltered for a split second. The room seemed to hold its breath, hanging on the quiet gravity of each word as the narrative unfolded. This wasn't dramatized, wasn't exaggerated. It was factual, precise, and undeniable. I continued, detailing nights when he claimed to work late, the receipts from restaurants he had never mentioned, and the whispered messages late at night. I described how I had observed small, subtle behaviors that no one else noticed, the perfume, the furtive glances, the minor inconsistencies that seemed irrelevant alone but formed a pattern over time. As I spoke, I saw the tension ripple through the room. The clerk shifted, the court reporter paused briefly, and even the bailiff straightened as if sensing the gravity of what was being revealed. David's pale expression deepened as I read a particularly damning entry, one that described his efforts to cover his tracks, the half-truths, and the emotional manipulation he had used. He opened his mouth, likely to protest or interrupt, but the judge raised her hand slightly, signaling patience. My voice remained calm, but resolute, precise yet infused with emotion. I wasn't angry. I was composed. The contrast between my quiet clarity and his mounting unease amplified the moment, creating a tension that was almost palpable in the room. I paused briefly to take a breath, letting the weight of what I had just read settle. The judge leaned forward, her eyes scanning the pages of my journal, absorbing each entry carefully. David shifted in his chair, a subtle attempt to regain composure, but the pale color had not left his face. His lawyer whispered something to him, a quick glance, a hand gesture, but I ignored it, focusing entirely on the testimony I had prepared. This was my moment, and I knew that staying composed was as critical as the evidence itself. Then came the most critical section. I read aloud a series of entries that traced the timeline of his affair with clarity, exact dates, locations, and small gestures that confirmed the emotional and logistical manipulation he had used to conceal the truth. I spoke deliberately, ensuring that the weight of the reality was undeniable. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly as she absorbed the pattern I had laid out, her fingers following along the highlighted lines. David's face went pale in a way that suggested he had finally understood that his deceit could not withstand the documentation I presented. The courtroom seemed to grow quieter as I continued. I described my emotional journey, how I had felt confused, dismissed, and manipulated, yet had chosen patience and careful observation over confrontation. I shared the details of the receipts, the messages, and the subtle observations that many might overlook, the quiet timing of phone calls, the small discrepancies in his stories, the faint but unmistakable signs of another presence in our home. Each fact was simple, but together they painted a vivid, undeniable picture. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his lips pressed tightly together. I could see the tension in his jaw, the subtle twitch of his fingers, the rapid blinking as if trying to will himself out of the reality I had laid bare. His lawyer attempted to interject, to soften or challenge, but the judge's steady hand and attentive gaze silenced any premature attempts. She was listening, absorbing, weighing each entry, and the truth of years of deception was now laid bare in her courtroom. I closed the journal briefly, giving a deliberate pause. The room was heavy with anticipation. My own heart pounded, but I maintained control, letting the silence emphasize the gravity of what had been revealed. David's pale expression and the slight tremor in his hand betrayed the depth of his realization. He had underestimated me, dismissed my instincts, and failed to account for the quiet, deliberate patience I had employed over months. This wasn't theatrical revenge. It was careful preparation, and it was undeniable. The judge finally spoke, asking pointed questions about the documentation and the sequence of events. I answered calmly, explaining how I had meticulously recorded each observation, date, and inconsistency. I emphasized that the purpose was not vindictiveness, but clarity, to present the truth in an orderly, factual manner. Each response reinforced my composure, and with every answer, I sensed David's confidence eroding further. The courtroom dynamic had shifted. He was no longer the confident deceiver. He was a man confronted by undeniable evidence he could neither deny nor control. I noticed the subtle reactions of those around the courtroom. The clerk leaning forward, the bailiff stiffening, the reporter typing with renewed intensity. Even the few onlookers, silent and detached at first, were now leaning slightly, caught in the quiet drama unfolding. The tension was tangible, the energy almost cinematic. This was the culmination of months of preparation, observation, and emotional restraint, now converging in a moment that could not be ignored. Finally, the judge set the journal aside and looked directly at David. Her voice was calm but firm. She asked a single, pointed question that cut through any lingering doubt. I watched as his eyes widened, the color draining further from his face. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, words failing him. The courtroom held its collective breath as the weight of the question and the undeniable truth of the journal settled fully upon him. I felt a strange sense of relief, a quiet vindication that was almost sacred in its simplicity. As the judge moved on to procedural matters, I allowed myself a moment to exhale. I felt a strange mixture of triumph and serenity. This was not about spectacle or revenge. It was about truth, observation, and integrity. My careful documentation had done its job. The entries, once private and personal, had transformed into a force that exposed reality without exaggeration, embellishment, or dramatization. David's pale face, the subtle tremor in his hand, the quiet reactions of those around him, they were proof enough of what meticulous patience and careful preparation could achieve. Even as the hearing continued with other procedural details, I kept my composure, letting the evidence I had prepared speak louder than any argument, any denial, or any protest. The journal had become my voice, my witness, and my instrument of justice. And in that quiet, intense courtroom, I realized something profound. The careful cultivation of truth, observation, and emotional clarity could triumph over deceit and manipulation, not with drama or spectacle, but with undeniable, patient precision. The courtroom emptied slowly, leaving behind the lingering echoes of words spoken, truths revealed, and tensions laid bare. I remained in my seat for a few moments, feeling the soft thrum of my heartbeat in my ears, a quiet reminder of the storm that had finally passed. David had left the room first, his lawyer trailing closely behind, their expressions unreadable, but undeniably marked by the weight of what had just unfolded. I allowed myself a slow, deliberate exhale, a release I hadn't realized I had been holding for months. As I stepped outside into the brisk autumn air, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. The light was soft, almost forgiving, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of clarity settle over me. The world seemed both smaller and larger simultaneously. The enormity of the events in that room contrasted with the everyday quiet of a street lined with falling leaves and the hum of cars passing by. It struck me, then, how much life had continued while I had been trapped in the tension of suspicion and betrayal. Walking to my car, I noticed the small details I had long overlooked, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot, the smell of damp earth, the distant laughter of children playing in a nearby park. These simple moments, once background noise in the story of my life, now felt intensely vivid. They reminded me of what I had fought for: not revenge, not spectacle, but the reclamation of normalcy, dignity, and truth. I slid into the driver's seat, feeling the worn leather beneath my fingers, and allowed myself a quiet, private smile. The journal rested on the passenger seat, my silent companion in this journey, a tangible representation of months of careful observation and deliberate action. Returning home felt surreal. The house seemed unchanged, almost stubbornly ordinary, but I noticed the small ways it had become a vessel for the story I had uncovered. Each room, each object, now held a dual significance, the warmth of domestic life and the memory of deception I had unearthed. I walked slowly through the living room, past the photos of our children, past the half-finished knitting project on the sofa, and into the kitchen. I brewed a cup of coffee, inhaling the rich aroma, and felt a quiet satisfaction settle in my chest. I had survived the storm. I had faced the betrayal, documented the truth, and presented it with calm clarity. Over the next few days, the legal process continued quietly but deliberately. I met with Karen, my attorney, to review the procedural outcomes and next steps. Custody arrangements, division of assets, and the formalities of divorce were discussed in practical, grounded terms. Each discussion reinforced the sense of control I had regained. I realized that my meticulous preparation, the careful cataloging of evidence, the precise documentation in the journal, the calm composure I maintained in court, had transformed a situation that could have been chaotic into one of clarity and empowerment. David's presence in my life diminished gradually but noticeably. He returned to the house sporadically to collect personal belongings, each visit a muted reminder of the life we had once shared. I noticed his movements, the subtle hesitations in his voice, and the carefully measured politeness he now employed. There was a quiet tension in the air, a recognition that the narrative had shifted irrevocably. He no longer controlled the story. I did. Each interaction reinforced the quiet power that truth and preparation afforded. I spent those evenings in reflective solitude, reviewing the journal entries one last time before storing them carefully in a locked drawer. I realized that it wasn't just evidence. It was a chronicle of my resilience. Each page represented hours of observation, nights of quiet reflection, and moments of emotional courage. I allowed myself to acknowledge the depth of my own strength, the patience to wait, the clarity to discern, and the resolve to act decisively when the time came. This realization brought a strange, soothing sense of closure. Life gradually returned to a rhythm that felt both ordinary and profoundly significant. I resumed small routines, preparing meals, helping the children with homework, and taking quiet walks in the neighborhood. Each act, no matter how mundane, felt imbued with a new sense of purpose. I noticed how much of my emotional energy, once consumed by suspicion and fear, could now be redirected towards self-care, family, and the small pleasures of everyday life. The quiet victory I had earned was not about public recognition. It was about reclaiming my sense of agency and rebuilding the foundation of my life. I began reflecting on the transformation I had undergone. The woman who had sat silently in her kitchen, uncertain and anxious, had evolved into someone capable of precise action, strategic thinking, and emotional resilience. The journal, once a simple tool for venting and reflection, had become both shield and sword, a record of truth and a vehicle for justice. I realized that the quiet power of preparation, patience, and meticulous observation could outlast anger, deception, and even fear. The children sensed the subtle shift in the household. Their laughter returned to its natural cadence. The small rituals of bedtime stories and shared meals regained their warmth, and the tension that had quietly permeated the air lifted incrementally. I observed their smiles, their curious questions about the world, and felt an even deeper motivation to maintain stability and calm. I knew that the battle had been mine, but the ultimate victory was in safeguarding their emotional well-being, preserving a sense of normalcy amidst the upheaval. One afternoon, while organizing a stack of papers in the home office, I paused to notice how much control I had regained over my environment. Each drawer, each folder, each item meticulously organized felt symbolic of the internal order I had reclaimed. The chaos of betrayal and uncertainty had been replaced with clarity, structure, and deliberate intention. I realized that my quiet victory wasn't loud or dramatic. It was composed, patient, and deeply empowering. I also began to rebuild aspects of my personal life that had been neglected. I resumed painting, a hobby I had abandoned over the years, and allowed myself time to reconnect with friends who offered genuine support. Social outings, coffee dates, and long walks with companions who knew nothing of the betrayal became opportunities to reclaim not just my household, but also my identity. I discovered that self-empowerment wasn't solely about exposing deceit. It was about nurturing the parts of myself that had been set aside in the service of others. Months passed, and the divorce was finalized. David signed the papers, his expression neutral, almost empty, while I felt a quiet sense of liberation. The legal battle had ended, but the personal transformation continued. I retained custody of the children, managed shared responsibilities with dignity, and maintained the emotional clarity that had been the foundation of my strategy. The journal, now stored away, remained a symbol of patience, observation, and the quiet triumph of truth over deception. In the evenings, I often reflected on the lessons learned, the power of vigilance, the importance of trusting one's instincts, and the courage to act decisively had all been validated. I realized that while the betrayal had been painful, it had also revealed the depth of my own resilience. I could face difficult truths, navigate complex emotional terrain, and emerge intact. Each moment of quiet reflection reinforced the sense that my victory was not only about justice, but also about self-discovery. Even in simple domestic moments, folding laundry, reading bedtime stories, preparing dinner, I felt the subtle strength of my victory. It was not dramatic, nor did it require recognition from others. The quiet restoration of control over my environment, my emotional state, and my family's stability was deeply satisfying. I had not only survived deception, but had also reclaimed my dignity, agency, and identity with deliberate, thoughtful action. I noticed, too, how my perception of the past had shifted. Memories of minor betrayals, suspicious glances, and unspoken tensions no longer haunted me with ambiguity. Instead, they were reframed as pieces of a puzzle that I had solved, a narrative I had navigated successfully. Each recollection served as a reminder of my patience, resilience, and capacity to endure. The journal had captured these moments, and in doing so, had transformed from a private record into a symbol of quiet power and personal integrity. One morning, as I sipped coffee by the window, watching the children play in the yard, I felt a profound sense of peace. The tension that had once filled our home had dissipated, replaced by an atmosphere of calm, structure, and emotional safety. I realized that victory was not always loud or dramatic. It could be subtle, personal, and deeply empowering. My quiet triumph lay in the careful, deliberate actions I had taken, the patience I had cultivated, and the clarity I had maintained even when doubt and fear threatened to overwhelm me. I also noticed small, unexpected ways the experience had strengthened me. Conversations with friends became more candid, decisions at work more decisive, and interactions with strangers carried a new, quiet confidence. I had learned that endurance, observation, and composure could be more powerful than confrontation alone. This realization became a cornerstone of my personal philosophy moving forward, a reminder that quiet, deliberate action often yields the most profound and lasting victories. As the months continued, I occasionally glanced at the journal, now neatly stored in a locked drawer. Its pages remained untouched, yet their presence was a constant reminder of the journey I had undertaken. I had faced betrayal, documented truth, and presented it with unwavering clarity. In doing so, I had not only achieved a legal resolution, but had also reclaimed my emotional and personal sovereignty. The quiet victory was complete, not in the spectacle of courtroom drama, but in the deliberate, patient, and thoughtful reclamation of my life. Looking back, I realized that the aftermath of the divorce had been as transformative as the courtroom revelation itself. Life continued, but I moved through it with a newfound awareness, confidence, and emotional resilience. I had emerged stronger, wiser, and more in control than ever before. The betrayal, once a source of fear and uncertainty, had become a catalyst for growth and empowerment. And in the quiet moments, when the house was still, the children asleep, and the sun dipped low, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction, knowing that truth preparation and patient action had guided me to a victory that was entirely my own. Sitting quietly in the living room one evening, with the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the familiar furniture, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had transpired. 15 years of marriage, years of trust, laughter, mundane routines, and shared dreams had unraveled because of someone else's selfish choices. It had been a deeply painful truth to face, and yet, in that quiet moment, I felt a strange mixture of relief, sorrow, and pride. Relief, because the deception no longer had the power to control my life. Sorrow, because the life I had envisioned with David would never materialize, and the trust one had placed in him had been broken beyond repair. And pride, because I had endured, observed carefully, and acted with patience and courage that even I hadn't fully realized I possessed. The journal, now neatly stored away, was a testament to that strength. Each entry, each carefully documented observation, represented not only evidence of betrayal, but also the clarity of mind, discipline, and emotional resilience I had cultivated. It was a chronicle of survival, a map through darkness, and ultimately a key to reclaiming my life. As I sipped my tea, I reflected on the subtle lessons embedded within those months of quiet vigilance. I had learned to trust my instincts, to pay attention to small inconsistencies, and to remain calm even when my heart screamed with doubt and fear. I had discovered the power of preparation, of patience, and of deliberate action. Revenge had never been my goal. My aim had been truth, and truth, meticulously documented and presented, had proven stronger than deceit, charm, or manipulation. Watching David's face go pale in court, witnessing the subtle shift in his composure, and knowing that the narrative of our life together had finally been placed firmly in my hands, it was a victory, yes, but a quiet, profound victory that belonged entirely to me. More than the legal outcome, more than the custody arrangements or the division of assets, the true triumph lay in the reclamation of myself. I had stepped out of the shadows of fear and uncertainty into a space of control, awareness, and confidence. Every morning, as I moved through the house, prepared meals, helped the children with homework, or simply watched them play in the yard, I felt the steady, reassuring presence of empowerment that had been forged through this journey. It was a reminder that life could be rebuilt, that trust in oneself could replace the loss of trust in others, and that even in the aftermath of profound betrayal, dignity and grace could be maintained. I understood now that true strength doesn't always announce itself with dramatic gestures or loud proclamations. Sometimes it's quiet. It's measured. It's patient, observant, and strategic. My quiet victory was not about shaming David or making others witness his failure. It was about asserting my own truth, taking control of my destiny, and protecting the life and emotional well-being of my children. In the months that followed, life regained its rhythm, not the same as before, but in a way that felt authentic, grounded, and sustainable. The laughter of my children, the warmth of my home, the small routines of daily life, they became symbols of resilience, evidence that healing was possible even after betrayal cuts deep. Looking back now, I realized that the storm had not destroyed me. It had refined me. I emerged from the courtroom not only victorious, but transformed. I had faced heartbreak, deception, and uncertainty with deliberate calm, and in doing so, discovered reserves of strength, clarity, and courage I didn't know I had. The journal, the evidence, the preparation. They were tools, yes, but the true victory was in the unshakable confidence and self-respect I reclaimed. Life had changed irreversibly, but it had not defeated me. I had learned that no matter the betrayal, the quiet power of truth, patience, and resilience can guide us through even the darkest chapters. And on the other side, there is not only survival, but the promise of renewed hope, self-discovery, and the quiet, unshakable satisfaction of victory that belongs entirely to oneself.